In the next few sections, we're going to discuss all the major features of human cognition that we identified earlier, beginning with the different types of memory. And the first question is, how can we study human memory in a scientific fashion? It's possible to study human memory using diaries, to test recall accuracy later against records made soon afterwards. But it's actually hard to maintain good controls to ensure that the same thing is being measured for every subject, so that overall characteristics can be determined. So a lot of scientific studies of memory have been by experiments under laboratory conditions, where inputs to human subjects can be controlled and their range of possible behaviors is relatively limited. I'll say more about the types of experiment later. A third source of information is the kind of memory deficits that result from damage to different brain structures. One source is bullet and other ordnance damage to the brains of soldiers in the 2 world wars in the last century. Another source is the effects of stroke damage. It's also possible to image the brain during memory processes, but there are limits to both physical and temporal resolution. In other words, none of the imaging processes allow you to discriminate between different neurons, or even between different groups of thousands of neurons. And the imaging approaches with the best spatial resolution, about something of the order of a few millimeters, can only reveal activity averaged over a few seconds, too long a period to image different steps in a cognitive process. Finally, animal brains can also be used to explore memory, and in that case we can probe the activity of individual neurons. But no more than 10 or 20 neurons at the same time from a population of generally hundreds of millions at least. And the absence of speech means that we don't know whether the cognitive process occurring in the animal is the same one as in the human brain. So, in the rest of this section, we'll describe the results of studies of declarative memory at the psychological level. First, semantic memory, defined as including the memory for facts and concepts, and also for remembering the meanings of words. One type of lab experiment that's often been performed is to measure the amount of time a subject takes to confirm the correctness or otherwise of some fact. For example, in sentence verification experiments, subjects are asked to respond yes or no to a sentence asking if an object belongs to a particular category, and the time they take is measured. Category verification is very similar. It just cuts the sentence back to an object-category word pair. Category verification can also involve pairing of visual objects with category names. There's a striking consistency across many experiments on many different human subjects. The time to respond to a typical member of a category is about 1.3 seconds. And it takes about the same amount of time to correctly respond when a category is paired with a clear non-member. But interestingly, it takes an extra couple of hundred milliseconds to respond to an object that's a member of the category, but not a typical member. Another way to investigate semantic memory and also speech processes is the tip of the tongue phenomenon. This is where you're asked a question and you feel you almost know the answer but can't quite verbalize it. In the lab, subjects are given the definition of a relatively unusual word and asked if they can think of the word. Subjects that have a tip of the tongue experience are asked some further questions. They can quite often identify the first letter of the word, or the number of syllables, or a rhyming word, even while the actual word is inaccessible. Now, let me give you an example of the type of functional model often used for cognitive processes. The spreading activation model was originally proposed many years ago, and it postulates that the brain has a linked network of nodes, where the nodes correspond with all possible cognitive categories. Each category node associated with a set of features, and each node linked to other nodes by connections of varying strengths. So thinking about one category can result in diffusion of activation that results in thinking about other categories. Now, this is certainly a way to model the performance of semantic memory. The problem is that it's not at all clear how to map these nodes and how they're learned into actual physiology and anatomy. So the model, there's a risk it could be completely irrelevant to the way the brain retrieves semantic memories. In the context of semantic memory, I'd like to draw your attention to the difference between recognizing something and recalling something. Suppose I was to ask you, what does the Eiffel Tower look like? The task is to pull up a visual mental image and describe the result. There's a fair amount of mental effort involved, for example in getting to the point where you could answer questions like, what's it made of? Does it have multiple levels? Is it fairly solid or can you see through it? How does it contact the ground? On the other hand, if I showed you this picture and asked, have you seen this before? Or is this the Eiffel Tower? Or even, what is this? You could probably answer much more rapidly and with much less mental effort. In other words, our recognition capabilities are much greater than our recall capabilities, even though we're dealing with much the same information. Some interesting experiments highlight this difference. Subjects were given a few seconds to examine each photograph in a set of 2,500. Then, a week or two later, the subjects were shown pairs of photographs, one new and one from that original group, and they were asked to indicate which they'd seen before. And they were able to pick the familiar photograph 90% of the time, although they would have had considerable difficulty in describing all those photographs. Now, episodic memory is different from semantic because information about time is also retrieved. We can answer questions like, how did the wedding go? How did the car crash happen? What was the lecture like? How did you enjoy the picnic? In each case, a few key words are spoken, and the result of mental processing on these words is that we can describe multiple sensory aspects of experiences that occurred at the same time or within the same time period. We are, of course, present at almost any event we can later recall, and often we can also recall our feelings at the time. For events in which our feelings at the time play a large role, those recalls are called autobiographic memory. Now, one general characteristic of event memory is that the greater the degree of novelty in an experience, the stronger the ability to recall the experience later, with some limitations if the experience is extremely novel. We can retrieve information about the relative timing of different events. On your car trip, did you stop for coffee before, at the same time as, or after stopping for gas? Events can be placed in a sequence. We can place events in order relative to time defined by clocks and calendar, and we can answer questions like, what time did you have breakfast this morning? So we have a reference time sequence and we can relate events to that sequence. And we can estimate the lengths of time between events, such as how long have you been waiting in line, even though we've not had access to a clock or watch while we're waiting. However, these estimates are not always reliable. Now, let me say a little more about each of these different aspects of episodic memory. Episodic memories are recalled in response to some trigger. This may be an external sensory input, like words targeted at a particular event, maybe a question, what happened at the meeting. In experimental investigations, a subject may be given some cue words like beach, picnic, or vivid memory, and asked to recall an event in response. Another type of real-world cue could be a smell that brings to mind an event. Of course, in practice, many recollections are generated by activity in our brains that happens on some combination of information which can act as an internal cue. In pathological circumstances like post-traumatic stress syndrome, very large numbers of these internally generated combinations all result in recall of a particularly stressful memory, and it's difficult to avoid constantly reliving the experience. And in general, the more novel the situation, the easier it is to recall later. In highly emotional experiences, it's found that we tend to acquire an enhanced memory for the gist of the situation, although recall of sensory perceptions is unaffected. For example, if we witness a crime or an accident, there can be an enhanced memory for the overall situation. And an extreme case of this type of enhancement occurs in response to very dramatic events like the assassination of President Kennedy, the first moon landing, or the 9/11 terrorism. Flashbulb memories created in response to the first news of such events preserve a lot of information about where the news was heard and what the person was doing at the time. Autobiographical memory is the ability to generate a narrative of major personal life events, often including our feelings at the time. However, frequent recall tends to reduce the degree to which personal emotions are retrieved, and these memories can begin to resemble semantic memories. Recall can change the content of memory. It's been found that subjects shown a video of an event and afterwards given incorrect information about the event, such as the colour of a car that was there, the false information is sometimes what they recall in the future about the event. If after a crime, witnesses are asked to describe the criminal, it often means that they're less effective in recognising that criminal in a police lineup. And in the extreme, it's even possible to create a false memory of an event which didn't occur. In some experiments, college students were selected as subjects. Their close family provided memories of childhood events, and some fictional events created, such as getting lost in a shopping centre, which family confirmed had never happened. Subjects were given one paragraph description of events and asked if they could recall the event happening and what they could recall about the event. This exposure to descriptions and subject response was repeated several times over a period of weeks. And at the end, some of the subjects were convinced that a fictional event had actually happened. Episodic memory is more difficult to test plausibly in the lab because it combines memories of objects, their relative location, and of time, often referred to as the what, where, and when information. In one of the best lab tests, images of different objects are located in different sections of a screen. The boxes all appear black, but subjects can activate a box to reveal an object, if there's any object in the box, for about 100 milliseconds. Only the contents of one box can be seen at a time, but a box can be examined multiple times over the period of 1 minute that's given to the subject. Subjects are shown different arrays on successive days, and on the fourth day are asked to recall which objects were in which positions on the different days. Different types of objects were used to test the effectiveness of recall in these circumstances. In the experiments, recall capability is quite high, but there's no difference between recall of emotional and neutral objects or more abstract and more concrete objects. Our experience indicates that we remember events better if they're unusual or bizarre, or in other words, novel. And the best available lab test of this phenomenon is comparing the recollection of lists that contain the same item in the same position, but in one list the item is distinctive. As you'd intuitively expect, later recall of the item when it's distinctive is much higher. Now, let's have a further look at retrieving the relative timing of experiences. We can answer questions about our experiences before or after other experiences. If you think about the process we use, we tend to activate a reminiscence of the event, then try to somehow push forward from that event. So what are the anatomical and physiological processes that implement this forward push? We may also use information about what you've often done in the past in the same circumstances. If often after walks we've had a shower, or had a rest, or had lunch, or checked our computer, we may run through these options looking for a match. So, what are the anatomical and physiological processes that implement the activation of the options and of the comparisons. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we can locate past experiences in time by the clock or calendar, but we seem to have multiple, what I'll call reference event sequences, like places we've lived, jobs we've held, and so on. And these sequences can be cross-referenced. For example, we can retrieve the dates when we moved into different houses. So we can use combinations of reference sequences to locate an event in time, or the relative timing of two events. If someone was asked, "When did you get that red coat?" the answer could be derived by remembering whether the coat was owned when living in different houses, then retrieving the calendar dates from the dates of moving to the house where the coat was first owned. The subjective experience seems to be comparison of the reminiscence of one experience with the reminiscences of a number of reference experiences to find a match. We're able to estimate how much time has passed, even in the absence of a clock. How long is it since this lecture segment started? How long is it since you last went to the cinema? The experience is of assessing the quantity of something which exists between two experiences. But the duration estimates appear less reliable than the use of reference sequences in terms of a match to objective scientific time. For example, we often have the impression that time passed more slowly earlier in our lives, and perceived duration seems to depend on the nature of the experience. Time seems to pass rapidly during a novel experience, but looking back on a novel period of life, it seems to have lasted a long time. On the other hand, time seems to pass slowly during a boring experience, but in retrospect, the experience seems to have occupied a very short period. And another interesting phenomenon is that episodic memory capabilities develop over time. If a very young child is asked what they did earlier in the day or the previous day, the responses are often quite inaccurate. And also, as adults, we tend to retain very few memories of our early childhood.